Good afternoon, class. We're going to discuss chapter 9 today, but before we jump into chapter 9, let's talk just a few minutes about what we learned in chapter 8. And if you remember in chapter 8, we kind of focused on concentration strategies, we talked about diversification strategies, and we talked about how to get smaller. And then we also talked about some portfolio planning. But on the concentration strategies, there was market penetration, there was market development, and there was new product development. And as you looked at the concentration strategies, we talked about horizontal integration, which you can do it through internal expansion, you can do it through mergers, and you can do it through acquisitions. We talked about vertical integration. We talked about backward vertical integration. When you're going back down the value chain, we're talking about forward vertical integration when you're going up. So think about the supply chain, the change, and you're talking about stacking. Horizontal is moving this way, horizontal on the chain. Vertical is moving this way, and depends on what position in the industry your company's in, especially on the vertical, whether you're, so on horizontal, you're thinking about rivalry. On the vertical, you're thinking about a leverage on, both buyers and suppliers. So depending on what relationship you are in that company is going to determine whether you're going to be functioning and trying to move and to concentrate your strategy either through horizontal integration or vertical integration. And then we talked about related diversification and unrelated diversification. And then lastly, so you've got concentration, diversification, and you've got how you get smaller. Retrenchment, restructuring, diversification discount, liquidation. Those are not pleasant terms when you're talking to CEOs of companies, because they usually mean, if you're getting into the how do you get smaller, you're usually found yourself in with some level of financial risk, or market's gone sideways on your demand and supply factors are kind of out of whack. So there is something that is going to force you as a CEO to go the smaller route, at least in the short run. Especially when we talk about retrenching, you're talking about, small retreats so that you can, you're still not, you may lose the battle, but you're not losing the war. And then the portfolio planning, they spent a few minutes talking about BCG and the little 2x2, and they had talked about the cash cow, the dogs, the stars, and the question marks. That kind of brings us up to chapter 9. And on chapter 9, we're going to talk about the basic building blocks of an organization. And they start out this chapter talking about the division of labor, a process of splitting up a task into a series of smaller tasks, each of which is performed by a specialist. That sound familiar? Who was it? Who is the economist that is kind of credited with talking about specialization? Adam Smith. Adam Smith, Wealth of Nations, talked about specialization because Adam Smith pushing specialization. Ricardo also talked about specialization, but Adam Smith is the one that is, credited with bringing specialization to the forefront. Can definitely improve efficiency. As I said, Adam Smith got it out there for everybody to understand in his text or his document, Wealth of Nations, and it's how to coordinate different tasks and the resources to allocate to the task. If I, think about if any of you have ever worked as a waiter or waitress, think about what the back of the kitchen looked like. So you'd put your order in and you'd head back to the kitchen, and you usually had a grill guy working, like the entrees, and usually, at least ones I worked at as a waiter, had a grill guy working the grill. You had somebody doing the appetizers, you had somebody over here doing the salads, you had somebody doing the desserts. And as those orders came in, they're pulling them up and they're all starting to take and do their own little specialization, which would be a lot more efficient than having the appetizer person work the appetizers, and then once that's done, move over and work the salads, and once that's done, move over and work the entrees. Now, from a customer's perspective, sounds actually pretty good because it slows down. My biggest gripe with going to a restaurant is the waiter comes running, or waitress comes running over, or server, whatever terminology you want to use, comes running over and says, "Hey, what do you want to drink? Can I take your order?" And it's like, I'm going to take your order. I want you to eat, and I want you to get out of here so I can seat somebody else at this table. Restaurants make their profit by turning tables. Servers make their profit through tips by turning tables. The more tables in a given night they can turn, the more potential profits they're going to make. If I'm going out to a restaurant for dinner, I want maybe have a cocktail, and maybe I want an appetizer, but I'm going to put my order in stages. I'll order the drink. When the waiter or server brings me a drink, and if I want an appetizer, I'll order the appetizer. If I want a salad, I'll wait till I'm done with my appetizer to order the salad, and the same thing with the entree. I treat going out to a restaurant as an experience, a social experience in a lot of cases, and I want it to be something. I don't want to come in and fork over X number of dollars and have it hurry. I hate going out to a restaurant on Valentine's Day, Father's Day, Mother's Day, any of these types of occasions, because it is how quickly can they take your order, how quickly can you eat, and how quickly can you get out the door. So think about a restaurant as specialization. Think about a pen factory as a specialization. You hear people talking about specializations as one trick pony. Specializing in a production process is efficient, but there's also some advantages to diversification. So we talked about diversification in the last chapter. There's, depending on how your company is set up, you can either advantages of diversification or advantages of specialization. Organizational structure is how tasks are assigned and grouped together with formal reporting relationships. And I've worked in healthcare the majority of my professional career. I worked in economic research service for 3 years when I got out of graduate school, but the rest of the time it's been in healthcare. And one thing I can tell you about health plans on the insurance companies on the healthcare environment, they are constantly changing the infrastructure. That it's just like, I've worked for health plans where it seemed like every 6 months you were changing the reporting process, reporting to different structures, reporting to different individuals, reporting in different functional areas. New CEO comes in, a new COO comes in, a new medical director comes in, and they want to restructure everything because they think they know how to do it better. So organizational structure is great. You have to have some structure around how the assignments are allocated and how the resources are allocated, but you want that organizational structure to be efficient and to be profitable. And you don't want individuals, at least from my perspective, it provides some level of inefficiency if that organizational structure is changing constantly. And when they talk about organizational structure, they talk about vertical and horizontal linkages. Chapter 9 now, chapter 8, we talked about vertical and horizontal integration. Now we're going to talk about vertical and horizontal linkages. Again, just think about, your graph. Think about, a graph, you've got the vertical axis and the horizontal axis. And that's the way you think about vertical and horizontal integration, the same way you're going to think about vertical and horizontal linkages. When you're talking about vertical and horizontal linkages, you're talking about typically an organizational chart. And if you've ever been in the workforce, you're bound to have seen an organizational chart. It's a diagram that depicts how company structures are built using two basic building blocks: vertical linkages, horizontal linkages. And again, if you've been in the workplace any time at all, I can't imagine you haven't seen an organizational chart. Vertical linkages. We'll talk about vertical first. Relationships within an organizational structure that shows lines of responsibility through which a supervisor delegates authority to subordinates, oversees the activities, evaluates their performance, and guides them toward the improvement when necessary. If I go back and think of the organizational chart that I reported through at Blue Cross Blue Shield, there was the CEO at the top. Actually, at the top was the board of directors. Then there was the CEO. I reported up through the CFO. So the CEO, the CFO, the chief actuary, and I reported up to the chief actuary. As the corporate director of payment integrity. So board of directors 1, CEO 2, CFO 3, chief actuary 4. I was like number 5 dude on the totem pole. And that was the vertical linkage of the organizational chart at Blue Cross Blue Shield. So I'm number 5 on the totem pole. I've got some managers under me. The managers have some supervisors under them. Supervisors have some team leads under them, and then you had your individual contributors. And so that's what the vertical linkage looked like in that organizational chart. It ties supervisors and subordinates together. Everybody knows who they report to. Everybody knows here's the reporting chain. If you have issues, most companies, if you have issues at work, you're supposed to take it up what they call the chain of command. Take it up through that vertical organizational chart until you get some resolution. Every supervisor except the person at the top serves as a subordinate to somebody else. So everybody, at least at Blue Cross Blue Shield, everybody but that's set on the board of directors is a subordinate to somebody else. It's typical business, have their structure that way. But think about schools. You've got, depending on how the school is set up, you typically have, at least on the side of the house where the professors are, you typically have a provost, and then you have some deans, and then down below the deans, you've got some faculty members, and the faculty members report to the deans report to the provost may or may not, they may or may not report to the president of the university. Depends on, more than likely they report to a chief of staff or a senior VP of some kind, maybe, or they may again report directly to the president of the university. But that's vertical integration, and in the academic setting. And then I guess one thing I did leave out, you've got kind of the provost, you've got a dean, and you typically between the dean and the individual professors, you've got a department chair. Just like chair of the School of Business, chair of Humanities, chair of Science and Technology. And so those department chairs are going to report to the dean's going to report to the provost, and the provost is going to report to somebody up above them. It generates what the authors call a unity of command. The principle that each person within an organization should only report directly to one supervisor. We'll get into some other opportunities a little later in this text, but when we're talking about vertical linkages in an organizational chart, you are talking about reporting to just one supervisor. Now let's think about horizontal linkages. Horizontal linkages are relationships between equals in an organization. If I go back to my time at Blue Cross Blue Shield, we'll just use that example. Remember, before I said I reported to the chief actuary, who reported up to the CFO, who reported to the CEO and board of directors. When it came to horizontal linkages, not only did I report to the chief actuary, but you had the director of actuary reported to him. You had a risk management director reported to him. You had a medical economics director reported to him. You had multiple directors reporting to the chief actuary, and that got you your horizontal linkages. We were all peers. We all worked together. We were all joined at the hip, and we all reported up through the chain of command up to the next level up was the chief actuary. And in Blue Cross Blue Shield's case, it was also the senior VP of operations. So you also had some operations people in that horizontal chain of command reporting up to it. You typically, when you talk about horizontal linkages, and they work really well when you're talking about committees and teams and task force. You're talking about horizontal linkages out in this direction. They talked about in the text about Whole Foods and their horizontal linkages and how they're all tied together to try to drive that customer experience, try to drive customer satisfaction, and try to drive profits. Coordination across multiple functional areas. And again, that's what we had at Blue Cross Blue Shield. Multiple functional areas, all of us directors on the multiple functional areas, all of us reporting up to that chief actuary, that senior VP of operations. And then you've also got some informal linkages. And when we're talking about informal linkages, they're typically unofficial relationships such as personal friendships, rivalries, politics within a company. Secretaries, your administrative assistants in any companies drive the organization. When you're talking about informal linkages, don't ever get the secretary, the administrative assistants crossways with you, because if you do, you're just dead meat in that organization, because they're going to be the ones that are going to get you access to what you need. They're going to get you access to maybe the CFO. They're going to get you access to the COO. They're going to get you access to the senior VPs. Those are the individuals that you need to make sure that you are in a good relationship with. As director of payment integrity and in Buffalo, one of the things that we used a lot of third-party vendors to supply goods and services that we didn't have. Talent pool was really shallow in Buffalo. So we didn't have the resources that we needed. And so we would outsource services, goods and services to third-party vendors. And one of the first things that the third-party vendors learned is if they wanted access to me and wanted access to pitch their products to me, they had to get by my secretary. And the only way they got by my secretary was by bringing her Tim Hortons coffee. Tim Horton is the Starbucks of Buffalo. Tim Horton's a hockey player in Buffalo that died tragically, and he had a Tim Hortons coffee, and I guess it was bought by Wendy's. Maybe Wendy's has already spun it off again. I don't remember, but my secretary loved Tim Hortons coffee. And if these vendors wanted access to me or access to my team, they knew they had to be on her good side and had to bring her Tim Hortons coffee. That's what you're talking about, these informal linkages. Informal linkages can be extremely valuable in any organization. And again, they're unofficial relationships, and they can be friendships. They can be rivalries. There's politics in every corporation or every company. So just understand these, while vertical and horizontal linkages are important, these informal linkages are extremely important. When you're talking about creating an organizational structure, no two organizational structures are exactly alike. Choice of structure influences the future company's strategy, depending on what your structure is. Efficiency may limit flexibility to exploit new opportunities or vice versa. Creating organizational structures, most CEOs or executives try to move them in a direction of efficiency, at least initially, but sometimes with efficiency and trying to gain access or to try to implement a very efficient product or process, you limit the flexibility to exploit new opportunities and vice versa. And with that, we're going to stop. And when we come back, we're going to talk about just some common organizational structures.